Well, let's go ahead and dive in. Like I said, the topic for today is mind-body dualism. This is the first part of a three-part series on the mind and consciousness. Now, this is a topic that's really near and dear to me as a philosopher and philosophy instructor. It's one of the hard problems in philosophy, and I think a lot of problems in philosophy are palatable. They're graspable. Like the nature of knowledge, for example. I don't think that's a particularly hard problem in philosophy. I think the nature of the mind as it relates to the physical world, what generates the mind, what's qualitatively different about the mind, if anything, what the causal relationship is between mind and body, or mind and brain, as we would describe it now. That's a really hard problem in philosophy. And in science, all of neuroscience is built around this problem. So, but I think it's also one of the really intractable, really hard problems to solve, because the nature of our mind and our subjective experience is so qualitatively different from the way we describe the rest of the physical world. We describe the rest of the physical world with basic physical properties like mass and length and width and dimension, electrical charge, and all of these sort of basic physics properties. Or even emergent, chemical or biological properties. But then the nature of our mind and the nature of our subjective experience, our self-awareness, including things like intentionality and perception, those seem so qualitatively different from the way we describe the rest of the world. So that begs the obvious question: what is the relationship between these two seemingly different experiences that are both a natural part of the world we experience? Is one reducible to the other? Are there two different things involved? Is there some sort of interaction between the two? These are really hard problems in the history of philosophy, and problems that don't seem to be getting any easier. No matter how much neuroscience progresses and how much philosophy progresses, this problem seems particularly intractable and particularly hard to solve. And for me, that makes it one of the really, truly interesting problems, because that speaks to a fundamental way in which our worldview doesn't yet add up. We have these different parts of it, the natural sciences and the way it describes the physical world, and then the world of our subjective experience and our mind and intentionality and perceptions and thoughts and feelings. And those just don't match with each other, at least not obviously. Some story needs to be told about what the relationship is between those two features of the world we experience. So that's the topic for the day, and I've divided this into three parts. We're going to revisit mind-body dualism, which we talked a little bit about when we first talked about Descartes. And we're going to dive into dualism in a bit more depth, some different varieties of dualism besides Descartes' variety of dualism. Let's go ahead and dive in. Actually, hold on here. There we go. So before we get started, the attendance question for the day, if you want to go ahead and respond to this in the discussion forum for this topic, is this very broad question to introduce the topic of the mind-body problem, the nature of consciousness. Are the mind and body, or the mind and the brain, distinct from each other, or is the mind merely whatever is going on inside the brain, or some other option? So chew on that and try to get your response to that attendance question posted by the end of the day. That would be very helpful. Make sure your counted is here. As you can see, this is one of the hard problems, and we're going to basically be looking at this question in various ways over the next couple of class sessions from very different standpoints. So I wanted to start out by giving you an overview of the different theories of consciousness. Now, there's going to be not a lot of context for understanding these different views, because we can't cover all of this in one class session. We're going to be focusing on dualism today, and we're going to dive into other theories of consciousness over the next couple of class sessions. But I want to give you the lay of the land as it relates to these theories of consciousness. And I think if there's something I want you to take away from this, it's not the in-depth details of any one of these theories. I want you to have a really broad understanding of the various ways that philosophers have tried to understand the nature of consciousness, and the what I would describe as the pros and the cons, the theoretical strengths and weaknesses of each of the views. And I think you'll see that the problem here, and the reason this problem of the nature of consciousness, the nature of the mind as it relates to the natural world, the reason that's been such a hard problem to solve is that each one of these views has some strengths and has some weaknesses. None of them seems to escape all of the problems or fully explain all the things we want explained about the nature of consciousness, which means there's a lot of really interesting theoretical work yet to do, both in the sciences and in philosophy, to reconcile the mind and the body, or the mental realm and the physical realm. if they're even two separate realms. So the first view that we're going to look at is dualism. That's the one we're going to look at today. And there are two forms of dualism: substance dualism and property dualism, represented in the readings for today by Descartes and a contemporary philosopher, David Chalmers, who's still alive. There are other theories of consciousness that we're going to look at. And I think the name dualism is clear. The name dualism implies that the mind and body are distinct in some way. They really are different realms or different substances or different properties. You know, dualism implies there are two things involved, either two substances or two properties. I think the name is really clear. Well, if dualism isn't true, the other alternative is what's called monism. And the name monism implies that there's only one type of thing. And there are various approaches to this. One is idealism. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the most common theories of mind in the 20th century have been materialist theories. And again, I think if you really chew on the terms here, the terms are somewhat self-evident. If the mind isn't distinct, isn't some non-physical, ethereal, metaphysical substance or some kind of non-physical property, then all you're left with are physical substances and physical properties. So in the 20th century, it was very popular to try to explain the mental purely in terms of material or physical properties. And there are several approaches to that I've listed here. One is called identity theory, another is behaviorism, and another is functionalism. And our next class session will be dedicated to these materialist and physicalist theories. But again, I think you can see the fundamental tension involved here. Either the mind is something non-physical, distinct from the physical in some way, either a completely different type of substance or a different type of property that physical substances have besides these lower level physical properties. Or all there is physical stuff, physical objects, physical substances, and physical properties, and you then have to explain the mind purely in terms of physical substances and physical properties. No easy task, given that the mental realm that we have in our subjective awareness seems so qualitatively different from the way in which we describe every other part of the natural and physical world. So it sounds promising, and I think this has been the approach that neuroscience has taken throughout the 20th century, is to try to reduce the mental in terms of what's going on in the brain. You know, what does it mean to have an intention? Oh, your neurons fire in a certain way. What does it mean to have this mental state? Oh, well, we can explain it totally in terms of what's going on in the brain, while sometimes ignoring the qualitative difference between the mental state and the physical properties of the events that are happening in your brain states or you know, neuron firing types of events, the kinds of things you can detect with a brain scan. That was the norm in the 20th century. But historically, dualism has been the dominant view. Plato had this view with the immortality of the soul. Descartes had this view in his view of the mind as a thinking thing that was distinct from the body, a thinking thing versus an extended thing. If you're religious, you have any sense of an afterlife after all, you probably have something like a dualistic view in mind. And throughout history, that's been the normal view. It's only in the 19th and 20th century that we get this radically materialist account of the mind, attempting to reduce the mind to whatever's going on inside the brain. And that has, like I mentioned, some theoretical problems that we're going to look at today and tomorrow. Let's move forward. I created this handy, somewhat beautiful Venn diagram. It's a little ugly. I'm not sure about the color scheme. It's the color scheme for this Google Slides presentation. But I wanted to try to capture these different theories and their relationship to each other visually. And I'll post the link to this slide presentation in Blackboard after the class, so you can have access to it and download the slide if you want to. Basically, you know, the outer circle is theories of consciousness. You know, what are the different options there are for explaining the relationship between mind and body? Well, one big category, like I mentioned, is dualism. And if you're a dualist, there are really only two categories of dualism. You're either a substance dualist or a property dualist. And the names are somewhat self-explanatory. If you're a substance dualist, you think that the mind and body are two different types of substances. And this was Descartes' view. Descartes thought that the mind was a non-physical thinking thing, a thinking substance that was distinct from what he called an extended thing, bodies that take up space and time and have dimension and length and width, the things that we use to describe physical properties. And they were just two different kinds of beings that were somehow conjoined together, which obviously that's one of the major problems of dualism. How do you explain the way in which the mental and the physical are connected together? And Descartes gave a really unsatisfactory answer to this. We talked about this when we were talking about Descartes the first time. He basically said that the mind and the body, the mental substances and physical substances, were connected together inside a gland in the brain called the pineal gland, which is a terrible answer. It's not even really an answer. You then have to explain why this non-physical thinking substance is connected to a physical thing like a gland. It just pushes the problem back. It doesn't really solve the problem. But that's substance dualism, the view that there is a non-physical substance or entity and a physical substance or entity. The non-physical substance or entity being your mind or a thinking thing, as Descartes called it, or your soul, and the physical thing being your body or even your brain as a physical part of the world. You know, your brain is obviously a physical thing. It's got mass and width and dimension, and, you know, has electrical charges inside of it when your neurons fire. Those are all physical properties. And if you're a dualist, you think there are two things that are connected together in some way that need some explanation. So that's one form of dualism. The other form of dualism is what's called property dualism. This is an interesting view that there's only one kind of substance, stuff in the world, but it has different kinds of properties. Physical properties, things like dimension and length and width and mass and electrical charge, all the things that physicists and chemists talk about. But there are also mental properties that, so for example, our brain is a substance. It's a physical object in the world. But if you're a property dualist, you think that the brain not only has physical properties, but a brain also has mental properties that are qualitatively different from physical properties. So it's not a matter of two substances being conjoined, like in substance dualism. Property dualists hold that there's only one kind of substance, but there are two qualitatively different kinds of properties that one substance has. And then, of course, you have to explain what the relationship between those different properties are. In fact, it's not even really clear that it should be categorized as dualism. You know, you could just as plausibly put it in the monism category insofar as there's only one kind of substance with different kinds of properties. I think it really is a middle ground position that falls more naturally in the middle between these two positions than being placed entirely in dualism. But traditionally, it's categorized as a form of dualism because physical properties and mental properties on that view are qualitatively distinct from each other. They're just different kinds of properties that are irreducible. You can't reduce, if you're a property dualist, you don't think you can reduce mental properties to physical properties like most of these materialists think you can. So then if you're not a dualist, you're going to be a monist. You're going to think there's only one kind of substance. And if there's only one kind of thing, there are two options. Either everything is mental or everything is physical. And the first view sounds crazy, that everything is mental, but there have been some philosophers in the history of philosophy who have thought that there is no such thing as physical substance. Everything is mental in some way. We'll talk about those philosophers here in a moment, if only to mention them and set them aside so we can focus on the topic of the day. The two philosophers that come to mind are George Berkeley and Kant, who we already looked at, who basically held that everything in the physical world is phenomena or appearances. They're mental objects, not independently existing physical substances. So that has been a view in the history of philosophy as well. It's a type of monism insofar as they think there's only one kind of thing, and that one kind of thing happens to be mental rather than physical. But the dominant view in the 20th century has been materialism, the view that there is no such thing as a qualitatively different mental substance or even qualitatively different mental properties. There's merely physical substances, material substances as they're called. There are some subtle differences between materialism and physicalism, but we're going to ignore that. We're just going to lump those together and treat materialism and physicalism as broadly meaning the same thing. And there has been some popular views throughout the 20th century. Namely identity theory, behaviorism, and functionalism. If you're studying psychology, you know a lot about behaviorism. If you're studying computer science, for example, you know a lot about functionalism. And identity theory is probably the simplest view of materialism. But we'll look at these mainly next time. But I wanted to give you a sense of the overall picture here. Almost every theory of consciousness can be placed inside one of these categories in some broad sense. And they each have their strengths and their weaknesses. Like I said, I want you to understand that the hard problem in philosophy of mind is trying to reconcile these two seemingly qualitatively different aspects of our experience, our subjective awareness, including all of the attributes of our mental experience, intentionality and thoughts and feelings and perception and consciousness, and reconciling that with our lower level physical description of the world, the kinds of things that physicists tell us or chemists tell us, even biologists and maybe even sociologists and psychologists tell us about the natural world, and trying to reconcile these two radically different descriptions of the world of our experience. It's a very hard problem to solve. I think it's one of the hardest problems to solve in all of philosophy. And again, the frustrating thing as a philosopher of mind is that any one of these positions seems to have its strengths and have its weaknesses. None of them seems to explain everything we want explained, and none of them seems to eliminate all of the potential problems and objections that you can have for that category of a view. It's a really intractable, hard problem to solve in philosophy. So I mentioned we're going to talk about idealism really quickly, if only to get it out of the way, because we're not going to focus on it very much. The basic concept behind idealism is the idea that there's only one kind of substance. It's a type of monism, but everything is mind or ideas. In other words, everything that seems like it's physical, seems like it's part of the physical, natural, external, material world is really just mental or really just ideas. And there are really two philosophers that come to mind. There are other philosophers, of course, but these are the two main ones that come to mind when we're talking about idealism. One is a philosopher that we're not really looking at in the class, George Berkeley, after whom Berkeley is named, the city of Berkeley in California, in UC Berkeley. He held that everything in the external world, what we would normally call substance or matter, the things materialist and physicalist philosophers had in mind about an independently existing external, material, natural, physical world, the things we ordinarily take for granted in the world around us. All of that, he thinks, is not an externally existing substance, but everything is just ideas in the mind of God. So there's no such thing as a separately existing substance independently from God, according to Berkeley. It was just that everything kind of exists as a mental idea inside the mind of an omniscient, creator. So there's no such thing as an externally existing substance at all. It seems that way to us, but really ourselves, our consciousness, the external world, all of it are just ideas in the mind of God. That was his way of reconciling the problem. Now, monism is interesting in general, because if you have the view that there just aren't two substances, there's only one kind of thing, in a way you can kind of solve the problem of the relationship between mind and body by saying there is no problem. There is no problem of a relationship between two different things, because there aren't two different things. There's only one kind of thing. It's a kind of philosophical sleight of hand that maybe fails to take into account the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical, the two ways of describing the world we experience, the mental way and the physical way. So that's Berkeley. Needless to say, that's not the dominant view in the history of philosophy, and not the dominant view definitely from the 20th century onward with the rise of contemporary neuroscience. It's an interesting strategy, though, and there are some modern variants of it, like panpsychism would be a modern variant of this view. The idea that even matter at its most fundamental levels, atoms, molecules, cells, every piece of matter has some sort of proto-mental qualities to it, to maybe try to solve the problem of explaining how the mental arises from complex arrangements of matter like you get inside our brains. So that's Berkeley's view of idealism. Now, Kant, who we have looked at in the class, is also known as an idealist, but he's known as a transcendental idealist. This should be clear from our discussion of Kant, but Kant basically held that everything in the physical that seems like it's part of the physical world around us are just phenomena. They're just appearances. They're a result of the way in which our mind synthesizes and categories and performs rational, logical operations on whatever reality is really like, what he calls the noumenal realm, the way reality is really like. And that produces the synthesis of reality in itself and the operations of our mind produce the world we experience as a world of phenomena and appearances. So ordinary objects in the world for Kant are not substances. They're not reality in itself. They're not metaphysically real. They are just appearances to our mind. In fact, they're appearances our mind has constructed and synthesized based on the combination of the world as it really is, which for Kant is always an unknown, unsolvable, unknowable entity. He calls it the noumenal realm, or we could just call it an unknown X. It's just a placeholder. We know there must be some reality apart from our minds, but we can't ever get outside of our minds to understand what reality apart from our minds would be like. So for Kant, the world we experience is a world of appearances. And so that's a form of idealism as well. It basically says the things that look like they're substances in the world, externally existing objects independently of the mind, are actually synthesized and created as appearances because of the operations of our mind. Now, he's known as a transcendental idealist because Kant still holds on to the idea that there is some deeper metaphysical reality. There is a way that reality really is apart from our minds. We're just unable to know what that really is. So there's still this transcendent metaphysical unknown X, the way reality really is. We just can't know it. So he's an idealist. He thinks that the world around us is just ideas, just phenomena, just appearances, but there's still some unknown metaphysical reality underlying all of it. That's what makes him a transcendental idealist. Don't worry too much about the terminology. I just want you to take away that both Berkeley and Kant basically think that the things that look like they're physical substances in the world, the external world, the ordinary world around us, tables and chairs and objects, houses, you know, the entire perceptual phenomenal world are not, they're not matter, they're not substances, they're ideas or they're phenomena. That, all of that together is idealism. But we're going to set that aside now and move on to dualism. So like I said at the beginning of class, there are two kinds of dualism, substance dualism and property dualism. And they're represented by Descartes and Chalmers in our readings, respectively. Substance dualists essentially hold that there are two distinct types of substances, mental substances and physical substances. And really, there's only a couple of ways of describing this. You know, what is a mental substance? It's a mind, it's a thinking thing, as Descartes called it, what he called a res cogitans. It could be a soul. If you're religious, then you would think a soul is something non-physical and somehow tied to your body, but it's a separate thing that is non-physical. And that is somehow tied to your body. So when the substance dualist says body, they really mean, yes, our body as a whole, yes, the physical world around us, could also mean the brain, though, because the brain itself is something physical. It has mass and dimension, and it has the kinds of properties that physicists and chemists and biochemists would talk about. And now the question is, what's the relationship between these two things? How does something non-physical get tied to something physical? How are they conjoined? How do they interact with each other? I think you can see the immediate problem with holding that view is trying to explain the connection between the two. And maybe you've thought about this if you're religious. I think a lot of you, from what you guys have told me, were raised religious. I was too. And if you're raised religious in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you generally hold that you have a soul, and that soul is somehow connected to your mind. And maybe this bothered you when you thought about this growing up. Maybe it didn't. Maybe you just took it for granted that it all worked out and it made sense. But if you take the time to dwell on that if you have some non-physical core of yourself that's your mind or your soul, and you have a physical body, and those two things are separate from each other, they're not identical to each other. How are they connected? How are they conjoined? How do they get connected together? How does something that happens to one affect the other if they have nothing in common, no properties, because the properties that they have are so different from each other? That, I think, is the deepest problem of substance dualism, explaining the connection between these two types of substances. Well, I guess I'll talk about this in a minute. I have a slide coming up on the pros and cons, the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these views. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But the other form of dualism, like I mentioned, is what's known as property dualism. It's a basic idea of not that there are two different substances, that there's only one kind of substance. And for us, 20th and 21st century thinkers, we're really talking about the brain here, right? We know that consciousness doesn't come from our hands and our legs and our torso. It doesn't come from our heart. It comes from whatever's going on in our brain. We know that much, at least, right? So property dualists essentially hold that there's only one kind of stuff, whatever there is inside my head, right? A brain. And that brain has different kinds of properties. It has physical properties, the things I can measure, the things like dimension and mass, length and width, and I can hook a a brain scan meter to my brain. I can, measure the electrical firings and the neuron firings. I can do a brain scan. And, I don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know a lot about this, but the kinds of things that neuroscientists can do when they hook electrodes up to your brain and measure something, all of that are basic physical properties, the measurable physical properties of our brain. But property dualists also hold that certain kinds of physical things, like brains, also have mental properties that are qualitatively different. Things like intentions and feelings and thoughts and self-awareness, all the stuff that makes up our mental lives. So the one substance, a brain, a complex substance with a very complex structure, more complex than any computer, any supercomputer even. The number of neurons in the brain is mind-boggling. And that substance somehow has different properties that are part of the natural world, as much of a part of the natural world as any of the physical properties that physicists and chemists and biochemists and neuroscientists measure. So it's an interesting view. It doesn't try to say there are two different kinds of things. It says, no, there's only one kind of thing, brain stuff, physical, objects, matter. And some arrangements of matter seem to have different kinds of properties, lower level physical properties, and some sort of qualitatively different, higher level mental properties. And they're not reducible to each other. They're qualitatively different types of properties. It's a very attractive view. I think you can see why it's an attractive view, because it solves the problem of trying to explain how two different kinds of substances are conjoined with each other. So that's substance dualism and property dualism. Before I move on to talk about the pros and cons and the strengths and weaknesses of these views, are there any questions about what the views are, and either how to distinguish them from idealism, or how to distinguish substance dualism from property dualism? If there's any uncertainty about what the view actually is, I want to clarify that right off the bat. Any questions? Okay, nothing heard, so let's move on. Before I talk about the strengths and weaknesses of these views, I do want to give a really quick overview of these materialist theories of mind. This is going to be the topic for our next class session on Thursday, when we talk about physicalist or materialist theories of mind. In other words, materialist theories of mind basically try to say there is no such thing as a qualitatively different mental substance or even mental properties. Everything is just physical properties and material properties. And then, of course, that's a really hard, even though this was the dominant view of the 20th century, and I think if you're a neuroscientist, you almost can't help but hold on to this view, that it really just is physical stuff going on in the brain, and that's all consciousness is. This was the dominant view in the 20th century, and I think it's starting to wane a little bit. I think we're starting to see the conceptual cracks in these views that seemed so promising with the rise of contemporary neuroscience in the mid 20th century. But the three basic theories are this: identity theory, and I think the names here are really helpful. Identity theory basically means mind and body are literally just identical. What it means to have a certain mental state is to have a certain brain state, and those are literally the same thing. Not two different substances, not even two different kinds of properties. They're just identical, just two different ways of describing the very same thing. Like, for example, if I was a neuroscientist, I might say something like this: pain, the mental property of being in pain, is C fibers firing in your brain. That's a type of structure in your brain. And an identity theorist would just say, those are literally the same thing. We just have two ways of describing the same event. If you're in pain, the mental way of describing it is, I'm in pain. That's the language we use for it, the term we use for it, for that state. But you can also say, well, my C fibers are firing. I'm in pain. Something is going on in my brain. And an identity theorist just says, those are literally the exact same thing, just maybe two different ways of describing it, but the same event, the same structure in the brain, the same physical event is happening there, just two different descriptions. I think that's the simplest kind of materialist theory you can have. You can just say anything that looks like it's mental, it's literally just identical to something physical, and that's the end of the story. I think you can see why this is not a terribly attractive view, because it basically ignores the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical. And if there's something I want you to take away from our discussion of dualism, it's to entertain the idea that the mental is something qualitatively different from the physical. So when a materialist comes along and says, pain is just something happening in your brain, I think you can rightly say, Well, that's not what pain is. Pain is a subjective experience. There's a qualitative experience of being in pain or having any other mental state. That sure doesn't seem like it's the same thing as C fibers firing in the brain. Those seem qualitatively distinct from each other. Even if there's some connection between the two, it seems like there's no, it seems like it's overly simplistic to just identify the two with each other. That ignores the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical, between a mental event and the physical event. But I think you can see why this is attractive. It solves the problem insofar as it just rejects the idea that there's anything qualitatively distinct as mental. It says, no, anything that looks like it's a mental event, a mental property, a mental perception, a mental awareness, any kind of subjective experience, all of that is just identical to some corresponding physical event in the brain. And that's the end of the story. And there are a couple of versions of this. I didn't put them on the slide here, and we'll talk about these varieties next week. But one variety of this is called type identity. The other variety is called token identity, whether entire types or categories of mental events are identical to entire categories of physical events, or whether it's happening on the individual level, whether a particular individual instance of a mental property is identical to an individual instance of a physical property or a physical event in the brain. Again, don't worry about that for now. We'll talk about that next time. But even within identity theory, it's a little more complicated than I just made it out to sound. But again, simplest variety of materialist theory of mind you can have, just mental and physical are identical, and that's the end of the story largely. A very popular view in the mid-20th century was behaviorism. In fact, if you're a psychologist, you're probably committed to this view already without even realizing it. It's the idea that what it means to have a mental state is to exhibit a certain kind of external, publicly visible, accessible, measurable behavior. Using the example of pain, what would this look like for pain? This is a question for you guys. What would be the external behaviors that go along with being in pain? Maybe in some sense define what pain is.
An audible ow.
That's one. You can probably come up with 10 of these, right? You say ow. What else do you do when you're in pain?
Let's say your body goes weaker.
Yeah, maybe you get physically weaker.
Yeah.
Cry out for help.
Right.
You know, you wince maybe. All of these are things that are observable, public, externally manifested behaviors, right? So a behaviorist basically says, what's for any given mental state, any given seemingly mental event or mental property or any item of subjective experience, they basically say what it means to be in pain is to have all of these complex behaviors that we can look at and measure and observe. Let's come up with another one. What does it mean? Even something simple like, this morning, predictably, I'm going to use my coffee as an example. I wanted coffee this morning. That was a mental state, a mental event, right? My desire for coffee. How did that manifest itself in all likelihood? You probably know. You weren't even here, but you probably know. What did I do?
You were tired.
Woke and made coffee.
Yeah, the obvious one is, I woke up and I made coffee, but even more subtle than that, like I woke up, I was a little tired, maybe there's an addictive quality to it where you get addicted to caffeine. If you don't have caffeine, you get maybe some type of withdrawal symptoms, you get a headache, all of those and all the things that go along with it. If I have a headache and I'm kind of wincing, I'm kind of tired, eyes are a little, red, acting a little sleepy, all of that is Zach needs coffee. Right? So a behaviorist basically says anything that looks like it's a substantively different, qualitatively different mental state is really just a very complex set of external behaviors that are measurable and observable in principle. Now, the advantage of that, of course, is that it means any mental state is evaluatable by science. You can do science on it. You can do psychology. You can do sociology. You can do neuroscience on it. If there's no such thing as a private mental event that doesn't have any externally manifested behaviors, however big or however minor that go along with it, that means we have some sort of experimental access to our minds. And of course, if you're a dualist, then you don't, right? If the mind and body are distinct substances, or even if there are distinct properties, there's no way to measure or quantify or observe what's going on in the mind. But if what it means to have mental states is to have a certain set of behaviors, that's what behaviorists hold essentially, that means that we can actually have access to what's going on inside someone's mind through the external behaviors. In fact, there is no distinction between the two. They just say that what it means to have a certain mental state is to have this fairly complex set of externally measurable and observable, publicly observable, scientifically accessible behaviors. This was really popular in the 20th century in education as well. I should mention this while we're talking about it, that this is sort of the philosophical underpinnings of a lot of what we do in education. This is the reason we give people tests and ask them to give reports and ask them to answer questions, the kinds of things that you have to do as students, and writing papers. These are all external behaviors that are supposed to show your mental understanding of the concepts and processes in question, right? Trying to translate the things that could be purely mental, understanding or awareness or the ability to do something, mastery of a certain topic, translating that into something that is observable and measurable and quantifiable from an educational standpoint. So I, as an instructor, and the college as an institution, and the state as an organization that oversees all of education, can have some assurance that you actually understand the concepts and you can do the things in question. So a lot of the things you have to do in the course of your education is committed to some sort of behavioralist view, that the way you evaluate whether someone really understands something is to turn it into an externally manifested, measurable, quantifiable behavior, some desirable set of behaviors that we try to cultivate in students as instructors. If I try to get you guys to be able to speak a certain way and think a certain way and being able to accomplish certain things, write a certain way, that is my way of making sure you understand the concepts and questions. You can do the things that you should be able to do. But all of that has a behaviorist underpinnings, that what it means to understand, what it means to have mastery of a topic is to have a certain set of externally manifested behaviors. I think a lot of contemporary education is committed to that view. I'm going to mention functionalism briefly. It's a really interesting view given the rise of computer science in the late 20th century. It basically tries to explain the mind as an input-output equation, a function. And if you're familiar with a function in mathematics, from algebra, really, the idea that there is an input-output in a function, right? You feed an input into it and you get a definite output. That's the idea behind functionalism. It basically tries to say that what it means to have a certain mental state, it's not just a bunch of external behaviors, but it's the right kind of inputs and outputs, a complex set of inputs yielding a complex set of outputs, some of which are behaviors, some of which are other mental states. So for example, if you think about what it means to be in pain from this standpoint, think of all the things that can cause the state of being in pain. Could be, maybe being burned. It could be, certain kinds of pressure on your skin. You get pinched, a whole set of things that cause pain, physical pain. And then think of all the manifestations that flow from that. There are physical behaviors, but there are other types of outputs, other mental states, like wanting to be free of pain, right? This is a desire to be out of the situation, whatever it is. That entire network of input and output, inputs and outputs, viewed as a functional relation. Given these inputs, you're going to get this kind of outputs. Given this complex set of inputs, you're going to get this complex set of outputs. Basically, a functionalist tries to say that what it means to be in pain is not just to have a bunch of external behaviors, but it's the sum total of all of these complex inputs and all of the complex outputs. All of that is pain. It's very attractive from a computer science standpoint because it's the kind of thing you can replicate with computers. This is all computers do. You feed inputs into the computer and the computer spits out outputs. So if we could build a complex enough computer to mirror this complexity of our input-output relationships as it relates to these mental states that we're so familiar with, maybe we can create artificial intelligence. So any view of artificial intelligence is probably committed to this functionalist view that given the right combination of inputs and the right combination of outputs, that the entity that's doing that, whether it's a physical brain like our brain or whether it's a computer, is going to have the same mental states that we have. So very promising in the late 20th century with the rise of computer science, trying to think of the mind essentially as a computer program, processing inputs and giving certain outputs. All of those are materialist theories of mind. So let's get back to dualism and talk about some of the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of these different views. I think the obvious strength of dualism, both kinds of dualism, but especially substance dualism, is that it respects the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical. At first glance, without any deep philosophical reflection, focusing in purely on our own consciousness like Descartes did, it should be somewhat clear that the way you perceive your own consciousness, again, I'm just listing things, and this might mean something slightly different to you, things like having thoughts, things like being self-aware, things like having perceptions, even perceptions like being in pain, having desires, wanting coffee even, though that mental experience is qualitatively different, according to a dualist, of the way we describe than the way we describe the physical world, right? The way we describe the physical world, think of the way the physicist does it. You can measure dimension, length and width and height, 3 dimensions. Things happen in time, across time. Things have certain other physical properties like electrical charge, strong and weak nuclear forces, all the stuff that physicists say about what the world is made of. From a chemical standpoint, the way atoms come together to form molecules that have their own uniquely physical properties, but still physical properties nonetheless. The kinds of things that microbiologists talk about when they talk about complex arrangements of matter in cells, none of which presumably have any mental properties, right? I mean, a single cell on its own, maybe even a neuron on its own, is not conscious, presumably, right? It has no mental experience whatsoever. You describe those things in purely physical terms. Even if you're talking about complex behaviors, they're just complex behaviors of physical stuff with no mental subjectivity, no mental awareness to it. At a certain point, you get complex enough arrangements of matter, like what happens in our brain, that seems to produce something qualitatively different. And a dualist says, no, they're really just 2 kinds of substance, a physical substance and a mental substance, what Descartes called a thinking thing versus an extended thing. Again, I'd be remiss if I didn't reinforce the terminology here a bit. Descartes described the mental substance as a res cogitans, a thinking thing, versus what he called res extensa, or an extended thing. In other words, something that's in the physical world that takes up time and space, dimension in the physical world. So he calls it extension. It means extension in time and space. And they're just 2 different types of substances. But again, that does respect the fact that if you turn your mental life inward and focus on your own consciousness, you can see that the things that make up your mental life seem to be qualitatively different from the things that make up the physical world around you. The 2 very different descriptions going on there, 2 very different kinds of experience, very different kinds of properties. So a dualist just says they're 2 different kinds of things and somehow they're connected together. I put this as an advantage. This is sometimes seen as a disadvantage by people who aren't dualists. People who aren't dualists think this is a huge disadvantage of dualism. But if you're religious in any way, shape, or form, if you think there's an afterlife, if you think you have a soul, then this view is basically the view you have, right? This is going to be most compatible with your religious view. Obviously, if you believe in the afterlife, when your body's gone, your consciousness or your soul persists in some way, in some other realm, some non-physical realm, you are committed to dualism, the view that there are 2 different kinds of things. So if you are deeply committed to your religious view, this is going to be the view that's most compatible. Is that a philosophical strength? I go back and forth on this. Sometimes I feel like that's not philosophical. It's more theological and religious than it is philosophical purely. But we did spend some time talking about coherence theory. And if part of your fundamental worldview, the inner part of your web of beliefs, is to have a religious view, you're going to be looking for a philosophy of mind that is most compatible with that religious view, and you'll probably settle on dualism. But I want to emphasize that view is not without its problems. It's very easy to say, oh, when my body dies, my consciousness goes on, or my soul goes on, or I go to heaven, or whatever the narrative is about what the afterlife is like. The hard thing is to ask the question, how are they connected together? So even if I have a soul, it sure seems like my consciousness resides here in my head, in my brain, right? It's spatially located in some way. But if it's a non-physical substance that has completely different properties than anything else in the physical world, how in the heck are they conjoined together? And an even deeper question is, how do they interact with each other? So let's talk about the disadvantages of this view. It doesn't seem to be able to explain the connection between the two, how a non-physical mind or a non-physical thinking thing or a soul is connected to your body or connected to your brain, how they seem conjoined together. A deeper problem is the problem of interaction, what's known as interactionism. And I want you to think about this. It seems obvious to me, maybe it's not obvious in the history of philosophy, but it seems obvious to me that one thing we really want to hold on to is the idea that the mental and the physical causally interact with each other. Our whole legal and ethical system seems to be based on this. You know, if we blame someone for something, if someone murders someone else or commits some other bad act, we want to say that that action, that action came from them. They were the cause of their own action, that they made a mental decision and somehow that caused their body to go do something that we find blameworthy. And we blame them for it. We punish them for it. We prosecute them for it. So our legal and ethical system seems to be committed to the idea that certain actions in the physical world, things our bodies do, are caused by mental events, decisions that we make that then cause our bodies to go do something. So there's some sort of causal interaction. It also seems to go both ways. When you stimulate my body in certain ways, that produces certain mental events. Like if you poke me, I go, ow. And it's not just an external behavior. There's this mental experience of pain that is caused by something that happened on a purely physical level in my body. So again, that's an interesting case of a mental event being caused by a physical event. And we want to hold on to those ideas. Even something as simple as my decision that I mentioned earlier to get a cup of coffee this morning. At a certain point, my mind said, I need coffee. And I stumbled out of bed and I got up and I got my coffee, right? But that was an event in the physical world, my body, my physical body doing something, interacting with the physical world, and interacting with a coffee maker and interacting with the coffee that was caused by a mental event, a decision that I made to go get coffee. All of our notions of free will and moral responsibility seem to rest on the idea that that there's an interaction between mind and body. There's a causal interaction, a connection between the two. Not just that they're conjoined together, not just that they occur, not just that they're connected together, but that there's an interaction between them. Imagine what it would be like to reject that idea if my mind never caused anything to happen. That everything that happens in my body was being caused by purely physical events. My mind plays no causal role in what happens. Imagine that whatever happens in my body produces causes no mental events whatsoever. It's hard to imagine what that world would be like. It doesn't square up with our experience of interacting with the world. So most people are committed to the idea that there has to be some sort of interaction between the mental and the physical. And if you're a dualist, that's really hard to explain. Causation on a purely physical level is pretty easy to explain. Two billiard balls, one running into the other. Two cars crashing into each other. The kinds of billiard ball-like causation that you get in the natural world. Physical events causing physical events. That's really easy to explain because the objects in question have the same properties. If two objects have mass and two objects take up space and two objects have dimension and two objects have momentum and that's why they're moving, then you can explain what happens when they bump into each other, right? When the billiard balls crash into each other, the cars crash into each other, when you bump around in the physical world, right? That physical causation is really easy to explain because the objects in question have the same kinds of properties. But if you have two completely different kinds of substances with no properties in common, physical objects have purely physical properties, the kinds of things that physicists and chemists and microbiologists tell us about. And we also have mental substances that have the things that the kinds of psychological properties that psychologists and philosophers tell us about, or the kinds of things that your religion tells you about and the nature of your soul or your consciousness or your mind. And those are two radically different kinds of substances with no properties in common. How do they interact with each other? How could they even interact with each other? So substance dualism really struggles to explain the causal interaction between two qualitatively different types of substances, mental substances and physical substances. A common criticism of substance dualism is that, again, there's kind of a pejorative phrase here, but I think it's a fun pejorative phrase, that it's kind of spooky. It's overly metaphysical. We have a physical body and a physical brain, but then there's kind of something kind of spooky and ethereal and metaphysical, a non-physical mind, a non-physical substance, non-physical soul. That's kind of spooky and metaphysical if you have this naturalistic, scientistic, 20th and 21st century worldview, which is that we're fundamentally physical objects in a physical world that somehow have mental properties. But saying that those mental properties are explained by a non-physical substance, like a soul or an ethereal, free-floating, Cartesian thinking thing, a mind that's not a physical, not tied to the physical in any deep way, that's pejoratively described as spooky dualism, a dualism that's overly metaphysical, maybe needlessly metaphysical. And I think if you think about this, most of us, even if you're religious, you probably have this notion that whatever is going on in your mind is somehow related to what's going on inside your brain. It's tied to the physical world in some way. In some way yet to be discovered. Maybe you don't think about it if you're religious. It's easy to kind of hand wave and say, I don't really understand that problem, don't know how it works. But there's two conflicting things here. This notion that you have a non-physical mind or a soul that's connected with your brain, while simultaneously thinking that whatever's going on in your mind, whatever mental states and experiences you're having, are tied to whatever's going on in your brain. It's not obvious at all how those two views match up. And if you really hold on to the latter view, that your mental states and your mental experiences and your subjective experience of the world is caused in some way by what's going on in the brain, it's really difficult to see how you can also hold the view that your mind is something non-physical and dualistic, like Descartes or Plato or a religious view would hold. There's an inherent tension in holding those two things. So that's the basic pros and cons of substance dualism. Needless to say, it's not been a terribly popular view in the 20th century insofar as neuroscience has been very successful. Neuroscience has been very successful at saying, well, when you poke the brain this way, or when this kind of event happens in your brain, and the kinds of things we can measure with a brain scan, those produce certain kinds of mental events that we can demonstrate because we can experiment. We can poke people's brains and produce certain phenomena in them, certain mental events in them. And neuroscience has been very successful at identifying which kinds of mental events and which kinds of subjective experiences are tied to which kinds of events in the brain. So if you think that project of explaining consciousness in terms of the brain is going to be successful, dualism is not going to look like a terribly plausible view to you, given the success of contemporary neuroscience in the 20th and now 21st century. Let's move on and talk about property dualism. So again, property dualism, just to review, is the view that there's not two different kinds of substances, no mental substances and physical substances, but there's only one kind of substance that has qualitatively different properties. And really what that means here for most of us is the brain, right? We have a brain. It's an object in the world like any other object in the world. It's very complex, massive number of neurons, complex patterns, complex networks of neurons, complex ways in which our neurons fire in interesting patterns. Again, I'm a little out of my element here. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think you get the idea. There's a very complex set of things going on inside any one of our brains. Complex structures, complex events, complex networks of neurons, structures of the brain that are related to each other and interactions between them. But there's only one kind of thing, whatever all of that is inside the brain, and that somehow has two different kinds of properties. It has lower level physical properties, the kinds of things that you can look at when you measure the brain, right? You can measure the size of the brain. You can look at the physical structures in the brain. You can measure the electrons firing with a brain scan. All the things you can measure from a physical or chemical or biochemical standpoint, even from an anatomical standpoint. And then there's the mental properties that the brain has. The brain has all those lower level physical properties, but it also seems to have higher level mental properties. It has feelings and thoughts and intentions and desires and self-awareness and subjectivity and all the things that we talk about when we describe our mental life and ourselves as mental beings. And somehow that brain, my brain and your brains, have both of those kinds of properties. But again, it's not two different kinds of substances. There aren't two things that are connected together. It's one object, one brain with two different kinds of properties, physical properties and mental properties. So let's talk about some of the advantages of that. One advantage of that view is that it also seems to respect the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical. If they really are two different kinds of properties, lower level physical properties and higher level mental properties, and those are qualitatively distinct from each other and not reducible to each other, then that sure seems to respect the intuition that the mental is qualitatively different from the physical. And I think our subjective experience forces us in that direction. When we focus on our mental lives, it sure seems like our mental states are qualitatively different from the way we describe everything in the physical world, even the way we describe the physical events in our own brains. So that's an advantage if you take that qualitative difference between the mental and the physical seriously. And again, this is an advantage over materialism, because if you're a materialist, you're trying to explain away the mental. You're trying to say, yeah, it looks like it's mental, it looks like it's distinct, looks like it's qualitatively different, but really it's just stuff going on in the brain. And you're trying to kind of explain away the qualitative difference of the mental. But property dualism takes that qualitative difference seriously. It says, no. There really is a qualitative difference between lower level physical descriptions of anything in the physical world, including the physical properties of our brains, and the qualitatively different mental descriptions and mental properties that that brain has. And there are just two different kinds of properties here in the world. There are physical properties, and some physical things seem to also have mental properties, and that's the end of the story. So it respects the difference between the mental and the physical. It doesn't try to explain the mental away like so much of neuroscience does and so much of behaviorist psychology does. Because it's not a matter of conjoining a non-physical substance. Like, remember, substance dualism was the view that our mind is something, a different kind of entity, a different object that is non-physical, that's somehow connected, with our brains here in the physical world. But if you reject that view, if you say, well, no, the mind isn't something something inherently non-physical, it's not a separate kind of object, you kind of eliminate the spooky metaphysical nature of dualism. You kind of bring it back into the natural world. You still have different kinds of properties, mental properties, but you don't have to explain how a non-physical mind or a non-physical soul is somehow connected with the physical world. So property dualism, even though it's a kind of dualism, is arguably less spooky and less metaphysical, less problematic from that standpoint than substance dualism is. Because substance dualism has the view that there's an entirely different category of entities, different category of substances or objects that are inherently non-physical. They're metaphysical in nature, that are somehow connected to the physical world. Really hard to explain how that could be the case. Another advantage, and this is an advantage from the perspective of 20th century neuroscience, we want consciousness to be tied to the brain, right? It seems so obvious to our 20th and 21st century mindset that whatever's happening in our mental lives, it's at least connected and tied in some way to what's going on in the brain. And dualism, substance dualism, the view that Descartes had, really struggled to explain how that could be the case, struggled to explain how a free-floating, non-physical substance or soul or thinking thing is connected to the brain. But property dualism doesn't have this problem. If there's just one brain and it has two different kinds of properties, then at least those mental properties are tied to what's going on in the brain. Maybe there still needs to be a story told about how those events in the brain produce certain kinds of mental phenomena, mental properties. But at least whatever our mental lives are, they're tied to what's going on in the brain. And from the perspective of 20th and 21st century neuroscience, that's a good thing, because we don't like free-floating minds that aren't connected to the brain in some way. That view is spooky and metaphysical and problematic. Problematic to explain how there could be causal interaction between something non-physical and something physical. But if we can say that mental properties are, even though they're mental and they're qualitatively different properties, if they're properties of the brain, then at least those mental properties are tied to the brain, and neuroscience seems to like that view. So it's an attractive view. It solves some of the problems of substance dualism, but it creates some problems of its own. it also seems to struggle a bit to explain how that one kind of object, namely the brain, which is something physical, can instantiate a qualitatively different kind of property in the first place. It doesn't seem to actually explain how the brain can produce a qualitatively different kind of property besides the lower level physical properties that the brain instantiates, the kinds of things you can pick up on a brain scan, so to speak, the things you can measure and quantify, electrical impulses and patterns of neurons firing. The brain seems to instantiate a qualitatively different kind of property, intentionality and thoughts and feelings and desires and all the stuff that our mind has. Why does a physical object like the brain produce those qualitatively different kinds of phenomena? So you could say that property dualism, it's more attractive as a view because it ties consciousness to the brain, but maybe it doesn't really fare any better from an explanatory standpoint at explaining why certain kinds of qualitatively different mental phenomena are instantiated by whatever's going on inside the brain. So maybe it doesn't have as much explanatory adequacy as we would like to have from a theory of consciousness. I mean, what we really want, I think, is to explain, when this certain kind of event happens, not just that it causes a certain kind of mental state or mental event, but why does it cause that particular kind of qualitatively different mental event or mental state? And property dualism seems to struggle to explain that, although it's a better view than substance dualism because it at least ties consciousness to the brain. There's still a problem with interaction, right? If you have two qualitatively different types of properties, mental properties and physical properties, and if you want to hold on to the idea that there is some interaction between the two, even something as simple as deciding to get a cup of coffee in the morning. This morning I had a mental event. I need some coffee. That's a mental event, right? Some self-awareness of needing coffee. And then my body went to get coffee. That interaction, if you want to hold on to that being a type of causation, you still need to explain how a non-physical property can causally interact with a physical property. And maybe that's no better than substance dualism from the perspective of causal interaction between the mental and the physical. And then in a moment, we're going to talk about what's known as the hard problem of consciousness, which is a concept or a way of describing this problem that the contemporary philosopher David Chalmers has invented as a way of describing what he perceives as the hard problem of consciousness and the hard problem of neuroscience. We'll talk about that in a moment. So speaking of David Chalmers, he's a contemporary philosopher of mind. Quite entertaining. I think I required a video or two from him in Blackboard. Easy to find. If you get on YouTube and Google David Chalmers, you can find some videos from him where he talks about this. He basically says that there are two problems of consciousness, what he calls the easy problem and the hard problem. The easy problem, he says, are the kinds of things that neuroscientists do, correlating mental events with physical events in the brain. Basically, it boils down to this. For any given mental state, being able to identify what's going on in the brain when someone has that mental state, drawing correlations between the brain and certain kinds of mental events. Neuroscience has gotten very, very good at this, right? We understand a lot about which kinds of mental events are produced by which kinds of physical events in the brain. Neuroscience has been very, very successful in this regard. But what's interesting here is David Chalmers is saying that's still the easy problem of consciousness. You can essentially poke the brain and produce certain kinds of phenomena. Or you can sit down and ask someone, what mental states are you in? Are you in pain? Are you in, pick your favorite mental state? And we can kind of measure what's going on in their brain and identify which parts of the brain are active and which neurons are firing. We're getting really good at correlating mental events with physical events in the brain. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so if a neuroscientist is here, they could talk about this, till the cows come home and explain this in detail. But I think you see the idea. Whatever's going on in the brain produces certain kinds of mental events. We're getting good at poking the brain in certain ways and producing mental events. And we're getting good at saying for any given mental event, here's what's going on in certain structures of the brain. And that's the easy problem, David Chalmers says. The hard problem is explaining why certain kinds of mental events are instantiated by certain kinds of physical events, especially if those mental events are qualitatively different. In other words, if it's property dualism, if those mental events and properties are substantively different from the physical events that go alongside them. Why do those particular mental events and those particular forms of consciousness and those particular states of self-awareness those particular perceptions, why do those get instantiated when the brain gets stimulated, or when certain events happen in the brain a certain way, and not some other kinds of mental events? And basically he's saying that neuroscience, however successful it's being at correlating mental events with events in the brain, is no closer to solving the hard problem of consciousness, of explaining why certain kinds of mental events happen when certain things happen in the brain, why certain qualitatively different phenomena seem to emerge out of the brain and not some other mental events or mental states or other forms of subjective awareness. So this problem, and what you could describe as the problem of emergence, given a complex structure like what's going on in the brain, given a complex set of events like neurons firing and complex patterns of neural networks, why that produces a qualitatively different property. It's novel. Like, before there were complex structures in the world, those mental phenomena didn't exist, right? I mean, think back to, shortly after the Big Bang, or even when the Earth was brand new, before there were life forms like us, before there were complex structures, there were no mental events, right? It's just purely physical stuff in the world. At a certain point, matter got arranged in a certain way, like what's going on in our brains, because of evolutionary processes, presumably. And at a certain point, mental existence springs into life. Qualitatively different properties seemingly emerge kind of out of nowhere, surprisingly, in ways that you never would have predicted based on anything that happened in the entire evolutionary history of the cosmos. It was novel, and it was qualitatively different, surprising even. So how does that happen? Why does what's going on in the brain produce these qualitatively different phenomena? So he says that's the hard problem to solve, why the brain produces consciousness in the first place, not just drawing correlations between consciousness and the brain, which is the kind of thing neuroscience does, but really adequately explaining why certain arrangements of matter seemingly produce qualitatively different, novel, surprising, qualitatively different properties, like the mental experiences that we're all used to having as conscious beings. So that's how I think of property dualism. The hard problem is explaining why qualitatively different properties emerge out of certain arrangements of matter. Not just identifying that happens. Neuroscience is really good at that. We know that it happens, right? We know that whatever's going on in my mind is tied to my brain. A neuroscientist could tell a lot about what's going on in my brain and why that's producing certain mental states, or they could look at my mental states and tell you what's going on in my brain to some degree. There's still a lot of room to go there. I mean, neuroscience isn't perfect at this. There's progress being made in this area all the time. But David Chalmers is saying no matter how good we get at that, at correlating the mental and the physical in the brain, we're no closer to actually explaining why mental events get instantiated as qualitatively different properties in the first place. It's not, in other words, what neuroscience doesn't actually explain consciousness. It can explain, it can tell you that a certain mental event is happening, or given a certain mental event, it can tell you that a certain kind of brain state is happening, but it doesn't explain why one produces the other. And it sure seems like, and I kind of take this for granted. It seems so obvious now in our 20th and 21st century mindset. If you reject dualism outright, if you say that, if you reject the kind of spooky Cartesian dualism where the mind is something free floating, if you reject the idea that we have some sort of non-physical soul that's connected to our body, then you're really just left with what's going on in our brains. So it seems so obvious from our modern mindset that whatever our minds and our subjective experience are, they're being generated by what's going on in the brain. So the real philosophical work here, and the real work for psychology and neuroscience and philosophy of mind, all collectively together, is to explain why certain arrangements of matter produce subjectivity and self-awareness and these qualitatively different properties that don't seem to be explainable at a purely physical level. And yet they seem so deeply correlated together, and yet it's mysterious. It's not obvious at all how something like a brain produces consciousness, something qualitatively different that has self-awareness. Every time you try to say, well, it's just a matter of neurons firing, whatever the kinds of things neuroscience would tell us, there's something that is lackluster about that explanation. You want to say, well, no, yes, I understand neurons are firing, but what I want to know is why I'm conscious when my neurons fire, right? Yes, I know my neurons are firing, but why does that produce consciousness? Why does that give rise to self-awareness? It's not enough to say, well, something's happening in the brain. there's a deeper level of explanation that's necessary to explain why those mental properties and events are instantiated in the first place. And that's the kind of thing that David Chalmers is saying neuroscience has been radically unsuccessful about, no matter how good neuroscience gets at correlating the mental and the physical. We should talk a bit about the zombie thought experiment. It's really fun. David Chalmers, he's trying to warm people up to the notion that there's something qualitatively different about the mental and the physical. Because again, the normal view in the 20th century was to try to explain the way the mental as reducible to what's going on in the brain. If you're an identity theorist, you just say, oh, mental events just are brain states. If you're a behaviorist, mental states just are a certain set of behaviors. If you're a functionalist, having a certain mental state, like being in pain, is just a matter of a complex network of input and output relationships, all of which is purely physical stuff going on inside the brain or externally in the world. But David Chalmers comes along with a thought experiment. He says, and it's a fun thought experiment. It's like, if you're open to sci-fi and fantasy, this is a really fun thought experiment. Imagine a zombie world that's just like our world. There's a physical world. There are biological beings with bodies just like ours. They have brains just like ours. An exact same physical duplicate of the world that we live in, ourselves and the external world and our brains. The exact same things happen. People, those bodies get up and they have coffee in the morning. They do the things they do. The neurons fire in the exact same way. Now he asked you to imagine, can you imagine a world like that is absolutely free of self-awareness? No consciousness, no mental events, no self-awareness, no mental states whatsoever. Purely physical causation. Everything in the brain that happens at a purely physical level. All the same things happen though. Neurons fire. You can measure the electrical impulses in those bodies' brains. Bodies do what they do. The external world is exactly like ours, but absolutely free of mental events and self-awareness. In other words, all the bodies in that world are essentially zombies. They have no mental awareness, no mental life whatsoever. Purely physical zombie duplicates of ourselves. He basically says, if you can conceive a world like that, that in itself shows that the mental is qualitatively different from the physical. It shows that the physical properties of the brain are different from the mental properties that they supposedly instantiate. There still might be some deep relationship between the two here in our actual world. But the fact that you can imagine a world like this, which I can seemingly imagine, I think you can seemingly imagine, it's a pretty easy vision to grasp. If you're open to science fiction and fantasy, or you like zombies, this will be even easier to understand. But if you can imagine a physical human-like body with a brain exactly like ours, neurons firing, electrical impulses, the body's doing what they do, including getting up and getting a cup of coffee in the morning, all the exact same physical stuff happening, but with no mental life whatsoever. That itself is supposed to show that the basic physical properties that make up the world are qualitatively different from the mental properties that they supposedly instantiate. So what to do about that? I think this is not to say that David Chalmers has the solution to the problem. I think he'd be the first person to say, I don't have the solution to the problem. The problem is that there needs to be some story told, some line of connection drawn between the kinds of physical causation that happens inside our brain, the kinds of things we can measure, and why those events produce certain qualitatively different phenomena. Certainly in the actual world, it looks like they do. It sure looks like our brains produce consciousness and produce subjective awareness and produce mental states like being in pain or having intentions. But the hard thing is to explain not just that it happens. We know that it happens, right? Neuroscience can tell us all about the fact that it happens, right? But the deeper question is, why does it happen? Why do certain arrangements of neurons produce certain mental states? Why does any matter at all produce self-awareness? And then there are these deeper, kind of further questions like, well, if our brains can instantiate non-physical properties, qualitatively different properties, can computers do it too? Can, if we build a fast enough supercomputer that's complex enough, that has a complex network of input and output relationships, can we get a different kind of entity, a physical entity, to also create qualitatively different phenomena? This is the mental phenomena. This is the fundamental question of artificial intelligence, right? Not just can we replicate consciousness, but can other kinds of physical substrates, physical systems also produce qualitatively different mental phenomena. So that's the zombie thought experiment. It's supposed to warm you up to the idea that mental properties and physical properties are qualitatively distinct from each other, especially if you can separate them conceptually by imagining these kinds of hypothetical worlds. Of course, you could object to that view by saying, well, maybe you can't actually imagine it. You can, maybe not coherently. You can imagine a physical duplicate, but if it's a physical brain exactly like our actual physical brains, wouldn't that physical brain be out of necessity force you to have the same mental states instantiated, just like our actual brains seem to here in the actual world? So it's not clear at all that his thought experiment is actually a coherent thought experiment, even if it seems easy to imagine on the surface. You might plausibly say that, well, if you have a physical brain exactly like any one of our physical brains, wouldn't that physical brain out of necessity instantiate the exact same mental properties that are instantiated here in the actual world? But again, what this does is force you to think about the hard problem. The hard problem is, well, yeah, maybe it would, but why? Why do brains create consciousness? Why do brains create subjective experience? Why do brains create mental states like being in pain? We know that they do. If they do so out of necessity, if there's some sort of law. And as I think about this more, what this really means to me is that there have to be laws of emergence. The only thing that will be a satisfactory explanation is when we can establish, given certain kinds of neural events, that will necessitate certain kinds of mental events. But we need to understand the law. We need to not just identify that there's a connection, but explain why certain kinds of neural events produce certain kinds of mental events if they're qualitatively distinct, as David Chalmers and other property dualists hold that they do. Again, that's the hard problem of consciousness, according to David Chalmers, and the hard problem of holding a middle position like property dualism. Again, the way I would put this now, in fact, maybe I could make a better graphic for this for next time, but if you imagine a spectrum, and one end of the spectrum is an extreme position like substance dualism, where the mind and body are just two radically different kinds of substances, and somehow they're connected together. At the other extreme end of the spectrum would be all the physicalist views, identity theory and behaviorism and functionalism. A kind of view that I would call reductionist, trying to reduce or explain the mind away and say there is no problem of the mind and body because the mind isn't anything qualitatively different. There's nothing special about it. It's just physical stuff going on in the brain, and that's the end of the story. Kind of rejecting the notion that the mind and body are qualitatively distinct, definitely in substances, but even in properties, just trying to kind of explain away the fact that there's anything qualitatively special or unique or different about the mental. And then property dualism and emergence sit right in the middle of those two views. It basically says that, no, yeah, it's a middle position because the mind is still tied to the brain in some way, but it's still not an eliminative position. It doesn't try to eliminate the mind, doesn't try to explain it away. It says, no, there is something qualitatively different about the mental, these mental properties that are instantiated by the brain. The physical stuff going on in the brain is not the same thing as the subjective experience that it creates, different kinds of properties. But then the hard problem of holding that particular middle view is to explain not just that there's a connection between the two, not just that they happen in the brain, but why certain physical properties yield something qualitatively different that doesn't seem to have the same kinds of properties as those lower level physical properties. And I think David Chalmers kind of has to leave it there. Like, how do you explain something like that? That we're no closer to giving that explanation, no matter how good neuroscience gets, than we were 100 years ago. And that shows some of the weaknesses of contemporary neuroscience, but it also shows some of the weaknesses of philosophy. If philosophy hasn't even been able to make any progress at explaining that, maybe this will be a persistent problem, for the rest of humankind. Maybe this will never be fully explained. But I think this is the challenge. I think what David Chalmers has done is explain why this is a challenge for us and why, what the challenge should be. The challenge should be not to kind of separate the mind from the body. The challenge should be not to try to reduce the mind to whatever's going on in the brain, but try to explain the qualitative difference between the mental and physical in some way. And that explanation is still forthcoming in some of the most exciting work in philosophy of mind and philosophy. This is the hard problem of philosophy of mind. And maybe in 100 years, future philosophers will make better progress at solving this problem than has been made in the last 100 years. But I think I'm a little pessimistic that we're actually going to ever have an adequate explanation that explains why the mental seems so qualitatively different from the physical. But I think David Chalmers has been useful for explaining what the problem is and what the challenge is, both for neuroscience and for psychology and for philosophy, in explaining the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical in a way that all of neuroscience and arguably lots of 20th century psychology kind of did a little hand waving with, trying to say, oh, well, the mental is not so qualitatively different. We can just measure what's going on in the brain. We can just look at people's external behaviors. We can talk about input-output relationships and treat the mind as a computer program. But none of those views really take seriously the qualitative difference between the mental and the physical. And that's what David Chalmers is trying to remind us of and get us to pay attention to in a way that he thinks all of 20th century philosophy and a lot of early 20th century philosophy, 21st century philosophy hasn't done. So we're out of time. Sorry, I went over a couple minutes. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me a question now or shoot me an email. Send me a message in Blackboard if you need. Other than that, just do the readings for next time on identity theory and behaviorism and functionalism. They're very short readings. They're just an online encyclopedia articles, shorter readings than almost anything else you've had to read for the class. So do those readings and definitely submit your attendance question response by the end of the day so I can give you credit for being here. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Have a good day. See ya.
Thank you.
Take care, you guys.
Have a good
You too.
one.
Bye-bye.